welcome to Teach with Your Hands, the podcast where we bring you the confidence, connections, and business understanding you need to teach the crafts you love. I'm Amy Costello. My guest today has been teaching ceramics at Penn State and in workshops around the world for nearly 30 years. He has worked in prestigious collections and has served in the leadership of several national institutions like the Archie Bray Foundation and the National Council of Education for the Ceramic Arts. But he first caught my attention through stories I heard about his teaching style, which focuses on creating space for students to build trust, explore vulnerability, and create without expectation. Chris Staley, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Amy. Thanks for being interested in interviewing me.
So why don't you start by telling me a little bit about yourself and some teachers who've had the most influence on your life in ceramics or otherwise?
I was always interested in art. When I was a sophomore in high school, saw someone throwing for the first time, and that sort of the magic of the immediacy of that process just sort of captivated me. Long story short, ended up wanting to make ceramics and teaching ceramics sort of a livelihood. Had the good fortune of having a lot of really dynamic teachers and mentors, and I almost hesitate to single out anybody because there were so many that I learned from, but I've always had a soft spot for Robert Turner, who was a teacher at Alfred just the first year I was there. Certainly the way he lived his life, both as an artist and a person, had a huge influence on both my teaching and art and just being a human being.
How so?
I think he had such a sense of curiosity about the creative process, about how we exist in the world, that it was sort of palpable, and it made me look and make things differently because of that curiosity. And with that curiosity came just sort of infinite possibilities of looking at things in different ways. And he had a real gift of suspending his own ego. And you realize that he was talking about things that were much larger than just his own perspective. That opened up all sorts of possibilities and different ways of looking at things. It wasn't as myopic as one person's opinion.
Did you know you wanted to teach from the beginning? Or was that something that came later?
No, it probably was always there. I played a lot of team sports in high school and even in college. And I just liked the camaraderie. And I was always amazed at how much influence coaches could have. And then I think a seminal moment for me was when the first time I applied to grad schools, I got rejected everywhere I applied. Actually, Robert Turner, at the time, I was an undergrad, but I had met him, and he said, you should go and study with someone that really makes taking pots very seriously. And he suggested Ken Ferguson. So I went as a non-degree student after being rejected to all the grad schools and working at the Kansas City Art Institute for a year. And that educational experience and how dynamic Ken was as a teacher and just the whole department with George Timmock and Victor Babu made me realize how life-changing a really good teacher could be.
So you've also been part of board of directors and the leadership of several national institutions, like I mentioned the Archie Bray, and there's also the Haystack Mountain School. What drew you to that world?
Well, those different organizations like Haystack and the Archie Bray and INSECA, they bring people together in maybe non-academic environments. You can bring a really wide range of ages and ethnic backgrounds and all sorts of professional backgrounds, and you bring all those people together, and there's no grades at those institutions or those organizations.
Mm-hmm.
There's sort of a earnestness or everything stripped down to what people really value. Or they're there because they want to be there. They're not there because they want a degree. And it brings people from all walks of life together. And so just serving in a way that might benefit others and this idea of sharing and caring, those organizations have such long traditions, of excellence, really. And just wanting to be part of that and contribute in some way was something that I wanted to make the time to do.
Can you talk a little bit more about the differences between those kinds of organizations and the university that you teach at? You mentioned grades. Are there any other major differences?
That's a good question. I think it doesn't matter what situation I've been in, but I try and ask big questions, like how do you define success, or what do you really value, or, how do your thoughts and feelings, how are they conveyed in your own artwork? in the university, it's increasingly become more vocational in the sense that people are there, they want to get a degree and they want to get a job. If you're going to be an art major, how do you make art and somehow find a way to make a living? There's an intensity that happens in the university in terms of the students bring talent and their work ethic. And then as a teacher, I try and help contribute in some way to helping them realize their own dreams and sort of aspirations. When I work longer, there's a longer period of semesters and years that I'll work at the university with the students. So it's much more formative. Whereas places like Haystack that people usually come for a couple days or 2 weeks. The Archie Bray is different because it's a residency program. So some people stay up to as long as 2 years, but there's no formal curriculum there.
Mm-hmm.
It's more just artists working together. And there's certainly an education that takes place there. But I've always felt in the university it's different because you're trying to accelerate the learning process because there's a sense of urgency about trying to make as strong as work as possible in a limited amount of time. Maybe because it's the amount of money and time that's being committed by students that I've always felt this tremendous sense of urgency. There's something about the workshop situation that seems more experimental in some ways. It's sort of, to me, like, okay, I can basically ask questions or do exercises that people can take with them. And the old aphorism, you give a person a fish and they eat for a day, but if you teach them how to fish, they'll eat for a lifetime. So it's more the latter in academia. I'm trying to teach them how to ask their own questions so that they can leave school and really be their own teacher at that point.
In an interview you did for the Red Clay Rambler, you said that academia doesn't like feelings. Can you tell me more about that?
In general, I think people have a more difficult time with feelings because feelings are unpredictable. They're very subjective. They can be more intimate than people want to experience. And yet feelings are incredibly revealing in terms of what we really care about. I've always been intrigued when I'll start to shed tears or get emotional and I'm not even sure why, or it happens at a sort of an unexpected time. And usually it's through sort of further reflection, I realize, well, there's something deeper going on here that really has some meaning behind it that I should become more aware of. I think that the feelings take us in places that we might go unexpectedly and discover things about ourselves that we didn't even know. But feelings, like I said before, they're sort of like, they're explosive and unpredictable. And in general, particularly in education, we don't like things that we can't quantify and measure. And certainly feelings are much more difficult. It's hard to measure kindness, really, or sensitivity. But those are aspects of life that really give our lives meaning.
So you feel that's true even in the art department where you work? I mean, usually I think of the arts as being a lot closer to that than, say engineering or mathematics or whatever. But
Amy, there's such a meritocracy now that, I've been saying lately that you're only as good as the last line in your resume.
uh-huh.
So, annual salaries are based on the amount of research or, your SRTE teaching evaluations or how many committees you're on. So it's just, you have to list all these things at the end of every year. And it just seems like there's more competition between academic institutions. And the way to amp that up is to have people be doing more research, be more exhibiting. So pretty soon that becomes the dominant sort of ethos of an environment. And it's not about connecting. And I've often found that true connecting is creating atmospheres of trust where you're willing to share your vulnerabilities and doubts, and then you really reach out and help someone. We really try and create that in the ceramics studio here, a place of safety and community and nurturing and affirmation. That's the type of environment that people take risks and go places creatively that they never thought they could go because they're willing to try things or they're willing to play, really. So that's a great irony in academia. It's become so stressful that it becomes antithetical to play or to taking risks because people are so frightened of failing. I think it's one of the greatest challenges, particularly in even art departments. The critique can have its value and have its place, but students have to be able to make work in a place that they aren't constantly questioning themselves and doubting themselves. There has to be a suspension of one's ego in some sense in order to, again, explore and be responsive to surprises and being taken in places that you never thought you would go before. And there just isn't, in faculty meetings and so forth, there's very little of that. It becomes very programmatic. It becomes very much about financial concerns. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you tell me more about how you create that environment of trust in a classroom and a little bit more about how emotional vulnerability is connected to art and creativity for you?
I mean, I read recently that Gaston Bocquelard, the phenomenologist, said what human beings value most is intimacy. He's talking about emotional intimacy or just intimacy in relationships. And I think that people want to feel close or have meaningful relationships. I guess, how do I create that, or how do we try and create that in a classroom? Every human being has something to offer. Whenever students make artwork, I can always find something that is compelling or has possibilities. So I'm really big on affirmation in terms of like, this is exciting. You're on to something here. You got to dig even deeper and go further with this, but there's something very promising here. And that sense of encouragement can be like a green light. The student can realize, boy, I can go with this. There's something here. And one of the things I do every semester is just simply words of affirmation. Students are sitting in a circle and I said, okay, it's like the mid-semester, you know each other pretty well. Can we just go round robin and can you say something positive about the person next to you? And that could be anything. You like their shoes, you liked how they helped you throw a pot one time. And anyway, to watch students one by one compliment the person to their left, you would think that they'd never been paid a compliment. I mean, they have this look in their eyes of appreciation that's just a gift. It's a gift to everyone. So there's a myriad of ways that I try to create a sense of community and support, but I would say affirmation and creating an environment that celebrates this idea of just trying things. It's not to say that it's not a rigorous, usually people that work harder have more confidence, and because they are working harder and have more confidence, they're willing to take more risks. So there's a lot of variables that come into play in terms of creating a dynamic, creative working space. I guess I would sum it up that cooperation, the etymology of cooperation is shared work. And when people are working and sharing things together, it's far more positive than a competitive atmosphere. Competition between people usually brings out the worst. There's a sense of scarcity, sense of lacking. People feel threatened. And when people feel threatened, there's usually fear involved. And then that brings out the worst, brings out self-judgment, judgment of others, brings out gossip.
I'd imagine it makes them less willing to take risks too.
Oh, there's no doubt. Yeah, that's very true. So it's a delicate thing, really, to create that atmosphere where people are okay taking risks. And, this idea, you hear a lot of talk in our culture about the importance of failure, taking risks, but I often feel it's just done in lip service. It's not really, it doesn't really manifest itself because the grades are looming or there's some really tough critique that's looming. But, this idea, again, of going to places that you are surprised, that you actually surprise yourself. And it almost seems like someone else is making the work. And that takes a suspension of ego, for lack of any other word, where you realize, that phrase, the process saves us from the poverty of our intentions. It's something about the actual working process that can begin to inform the maker of possibilities and different ways to go. So in other words, it's not a linear sort of experience, the creative process. In fact, it takes infinite different paths, but one has to be open to saying, okay, I'm going to take this new path, or just unconsciously going down that path and you not even know you're going down that path.
What led you to these ideas about vulnerability in the first place? How did you get the idea that people needed to be sharing more and creating a really trusting environment in order to be creative?
It's a good question. I think that, in working with students and really listening to students and what students have to say, and then this idea of asking a question that takes us to places that we've never gone. And honestly, I started teaching this course called Art and Life in 2010. And that really came about because I always begin every class with what I call trivia for the day. And trivia for the day is something about life and its relationship to art. And that could be anything. Even the word trivia means, in Greek means three roads. And so I try and talk about this idea that there's always more there than meets the eye. And this idea that everything we make is a metaphor. And so, I suppose the one year I was the Penn State laureate and I was going around all the Commonwealth campuses. There's like 20 of them in the state of Pennsylvania, and I would just be thrown into classes. I could be in an English class or, a design class, a real myriad of classes. And one of the things I started to do was ask the students to think about what experience or circumstances in their childhood most influenced who they are today and what they do creatively. And so there was a myriad of responses to growing up on a farm, to having been in a horrible car accident. I mean, just all different things that had influenced people's lives. But that question had rarely or ever been asked. Usually students aren't asked questions about their own stories. I read vociferously, and I was always struck by what British sculptor Barbara Hepworth said. And she said that perhaps what one wants to say is formed in one's childhood, and we spend the rest of our lives trying to say it. So I think I was influenced by hearing her quote and thinking, well, what is it that we can learn about our own backgrounds, our own stories? And then when students share that collectively, all of a sudden there's this sense of community or camaraderie, like, my God, I'm not the only one that's had an unusual experience or an unusual life, or all of a sudden I never knew that about that person. So I think those questions and that sort of uncovering or discovering of one's own being can be hugely beneficial in terms of the creative process, in terms of why we do what we do. Why are we drawn to the material we're drawn to? Why are we drawn to the imagery we were drawn to? And a lot of that comes from self-awareness. But again, I don't think very many academic situations are asking questions to reflect on those origins. Or, I mean, even Van Gogh in his letters to his brother Theo said the creative process is a circular one. I keep coming back to some essence of how I'm seeing the world. And I think that we would be better served as a culture to ask students how they see themselves in the world.
What do you feel is the purpose of education?
That's a powerful and large question. I think that really it's about being a citizen of the world. It's like, Mary Oliver passed away, the poet, this past year, and she famously asked the question, what are you going to do with your one wild and precious life? And that's a huge question, and it's an important question that rarely is asked. What are you going to do with your one wild and precious life? And another woman, MC Richards, said the biggest work of art that we create is our lives. And so when you ask those questions, you begin to, in some ways, lead a deeper life, a more meaningful life, a life of purpose. And that has significance. When day is done, when people get up in the morning, they want to have a life of purpose. They want, what am I doing on this planet? If I'm lucky, I'll live 80 years, and that's just a short period of time. Everyone that studies about the meaning of life and living a life of purpose, they say, in doing that, you have to find some sort of purpose. And I think making art can be an exceptional way of exploring that sense of purpose, because it's basically about making your thoughts and feelings real, whether it's in film or dance or clay or wood.
Can you describe an educational institution that would be equipped to fulfill that purpose?
Whenever I ask that question I always go back. It's an institution that doesn't exist anymore, but it's called the Black Mountain School in North Carolina. It was just in the 50s. But they were there. They were more concerned about what they didn't know. They were more concerned about the questions. And so it wasn't some sort of didactic curriculum or epistemological sequence of things. They were really asking each other questions, and that through that questioning, they really discovered a lot of different things. I do think that a lot of the nonprofit educational organizations all over the country, from Peters Valley to Pemlin to Pilchuck, Haystack, I mean, there's a lot of them, that there's something about those community craft centers that bring everyone together, and the teachers are constantly changing and being selected, and there's a richness and depth about those experiences. I think one of the challenges in our field, particularly the crafts, is it can be so technique oriented. It can be so, okay, we're going to learn about soda firing, or we're going to learn about how to make spouts, or so, that larger questions don't get asked. And I don't think we're really trained. Teachers aren't being asked to ask the larger questions. And certainly often upper administrators or the leaders of academia, there doesn't seem to be much discussion about asking these larger questions. So there does seem to be a vacuum or a void. And quite honestly, there has to be an intellectual rigor of asking questions, and then, reading and becoming informed. And I don't want to be misleading, because I think ultimately students really want to learn. There's this exhilaration in learning something, and they can go forth with whatever they're doing with a new perspective and a new way of seeing, because they actually learned something.
So we spend a lot of time these days pushing young artists to find their voice, which sounds to me like develop a style. And on the one hand, that does require a lot of creativity and exploration to come to a point where you've created something that's unique and recognizable. But on the other hand, it seems like that can become a trap where once you have a voice, you stop exploring, or you feel like you can't keep exploring because every piece has to live up to expectations. So how do you feel about the whole find your voice thing?
Yeah, that's a loaded phrase. I mean, it can mean so many different things. It sort of mean find your signature piece or find your style of making. And I think also when economics enter into the picture, some people that are making their living by being studio artists or studio craftspeople, that personally, I've always felt that when you're making stuff to sell, you're treading on really thin ice, sort of selling your soul. So it's a really complex issue. But personally, I've always felt I need to be going to the studio to learn something. Like the process has to be enriching me in some way. So I need to be doing something new. The excitement of going into the studio and realizing that you're not quite sure what's going to happen. And, I came across a quote that I found really powerful, that God comes to you disguised as your life. And even if you don't believe in God, you could say that education comes to you disguised as your life. So again, how we live our lives, maybe even in the studio. And sometimes I'll say I'm going to make 4 cover jars, and I make the 4 cover jars, and I think, okay, let's do 2 cover jars that I've never made before. So I'm forcing myself to go into uncharted waters and try something I've never made before. And inevitably, it's when I do something I've never done before, there seems to be this uncertainty that's very captivating in the work, because the work actually looks like it's sort of making itself. Something else is beginning to happen. And I think when we look at artwork that seems unexplainable, or we have questions about it, it's usually the work that's still alive. It's still evolving. It's like we can't even tell if it's finished. We don't know where it's going. And I think that's the type of work that is inspiring, basically.
I think I know the answer to this question I'm about to ask based on what you just said, but do you think that creativity has an end goal?
Only in the sense that this uncertainty, or the being exposed or growing in a way that we least expected it to happen. A lot of us, particularly when we're children and we're drawing or something, it's like we don't know where we're going. Somehow, sometimes we can really recapture that exploration and uncertainty. And there's something about that that brings us all together, because there's certainly no shortage of uncertainty in life. And when art speaks to that sort of uncertainty or that sense of possibility, there's, I think, hope. We are at our best when there's a sense of possibility, when we realize that there's more to experience than maybe meets the eye. So I don't think there is an end goal to creativity other than just the process itself.
How do you help students find a balance between chance and intention in what they're creating?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because in the end, there's this whole issue of quality
Mm-hmm.
and making really compelling, strong work. And if you want to make a living, you can't not deal with that issue of quality. And so, this idea of intention, a student can have the best intentions, but might be going down the wrong rabbit hole. And the work, for a myriad of reasons, could be because of composition or content or the craft, the way it's being built, just is not very strong work. And so as a educator, teacher, there needs to be conversations about issues of quality. And that gets complex because there's always a interweaving of objectivity and subjectivity. But in those discussions, there can be a lot that's learned. And so a lot of teaching is about conversation and sharing and trying to understand each other's point of view. So the willingness to try other things. I mean, intentions can get in the way sometimes because in your mind's eye, you have this very clear idea of what you want to make, and you're not going to deviate from that. So my feelings have always been, well, make the thing you want to make. And if it's not as strong as it might be, then try some other things. So there's something to be learned in trying multiple ways of approaching something, and then you can compare. So I think that the idea of numbers are multiple objects that are in dialogue with each other. So if you make multiple number of pots, there's some pots that are stronger than others, and you have to ask yourself, why are they stronger than the other pots? And hopefully in a conversation with students, they too will pick what they think is the strongest and have to articulate why. And so there's an element of chance involved in the willingness to take chances and to push yourself into trying things that you don't normally try. So I think it's this combination of both intention and chance that are working sort of in concert with each other. And both are important, but they're both equally important.
What is a successful class or workshop in your book?
I think when you leave that class or workshop and you realize you're a different person than when you came in, when you realize you've grown and that you're no longer the person that you were at the beginning of the semester or the beginning of the workshop, and you leave and you feel profoundly enriched in a way of going forward in the world as a more perceptive and sensitive and caring and just a better person and all the way around, more gifted, maybe realizing your potential as a maker and also as a human being.
Do you think that emotional exploration and artistic exploration can be approached in the same way? Or maybe, for you, it almost seems like they're the same thing.
Yeah, no, I think, some people are obviously a lot more intellectually oriented than they are emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that they're hard to separate in my eyes in terms of artistic growth and growth as a human being. I am increasingly interested in the relationship between objects and experiences. Truth be told, we live in very troubling times, whether it's climate change or our ability to get along or the increasing disparity between the haves and the have-nots. What role does art play other than perhaps it celebrates our sense of curiosity and our sense of wonder and the sense of like how we're all on this journey together because art asks questions about our art and life. So I think it becomes when those larger questions are absent, we're really not living up to the full potential of what art can offer. And that's one of the difficulties of teaching art, because they want to quantify and they want to measure and they want it to have a metrics. And they often want to reduce it to some sort of very, that's why when people say they can draw, can you draw? Most people are thinking, can you render sort of photographically, or do you have this technical virtuosity? But drawing can be done in so many different ways and in expressive ways. And all those ways need to be celebrated. And it's through that celebration of art that we might gain a greater possibility of how we can live our lives. I'm really intrigued with what we remember. What do we do that we remember? And why do we remember certain things? And there's usually some confluence of our senses or an experience that make us feel really alive. And so there's a lot of forces, social media, with Instagram or Facebook and so forth. The amount of time just staring into screens seems to be stealing something from us in terms of creating our own lives versus sort of vicariously trying to live a life through a screen, or doing things for the wrong reason. Maybe this idea of wanting to create for, I don't know, something about attention versus a shared or group sort of experiential thing that brings people together, that goes back to that sense of connection and how we make people feel connected in some way. So probably, Amy, a big part of that is our ability to be curious and listen. I think that's one of the reasons why interviewing is becoming more significant. When, you reached out to me and asked me if I'd be interested in being interviewed, one of the greatest gifts you can give to someone is to listen to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I can tell just by some of the questions you've asked, or someone that thinks a lot and is curious and digs deep and comes up with questions that maybe will take me in a direction that I wasn't aware of. So we live in certainly a very complex, fast changing world. And it seems ironically that we need to be perhaps reflecting and questioning more than at any other time because of how quickly things are changing technologically in the world that we live in today.
For your students that you have now, especially the ones that are at the beginning of their journey, do you find that it's more difficult for them to do the emotional exploration or the artistic exploration?
That's a good question. I would say that it really varies from one individual to the next. I mean, some people just seem so appreciative of anyone asking them about their own personal story, and they really welcome that. But I have had students that they're usually the exception than the rule, but have a very hard time talking about anything that's their own story. But I think the vast majority are curious about maybe their own stories and certainly hearing the stories of others. And so they realize the value in terms of what they're creating and what they're making. So I just think, I've had one student I'll never forget, she said, just tell me what to do so I can get an A. Just tell me what to do so I can get an A. And she had totally bought in to the sort of academic paradigm, if you will, that, it's all about just getting grades. And she basically learning was just something that was sort of getting in the way because all she wanted was the A. Mm. And that's education at its worst. And so, as educators, how do we steer away or at least create a different learning environment where it's truly about the joy of learning? And I think, again, it comes back to that sense of intimacy or real talk. Once a student said, I'm in this class because I don't like small talk. I want big talk. And I think people long for big talk. Even if you don't want to talk about your personal life, you can say why you don't want to talk about your personal life. And then that becomes a story in itself.
Yeah.
But communication is very important for artists to articulate their thoughts and feelings behind the work. And certainly as an educator, I mean, that's how we learn, is through communicating. and then responding to what we make. And then what we make basically informs the conversation and enriches the conversation. I mean, it's really exciting to be talking to someone that's making incredibly dynamic work. And you can tell the work is like beyond what they even thought they could make. And then you're sort of responding to this really work that you don't even know how to talk about the work. It's sort of leaving you nonplussed. And that is sort of the sweet spot. There's magic when that happens, where the work actually leaves you speechless and you have to search for why it's leaving you speechless.
What do you think is needed for ceramics education to move forward?
I feel really strongly that there has to be a much more holistic, interdisciplinary approach to ceramics and the arts. I mean, everything is involved when you're making ceramics, from social to culture to political to economic issues to historical issues. Just asking, when was the wheel invented? Or, what do you think advanced our evolution as a human species more than anything else? And maybe it was the fire and cooking food. Or what is the significance of a handmade cup? How is a handmade cup any different than, a mass-produced cup? Is touch significant at all in actually feeling, putting your hand where someone else put their hand, their finger tip, and made that dent? Is revisiting that dent important in terms of any sort of reciprocity, in terms of human connection? Family dinner time, what significance does that have? What's the difference between a ritual and a habit? I mean, these are all the questions that ceramic makers need to be asking, because they're not questions necessarily about how to make a pot. They're questions about how to live a life.
Well, let's see. I think that's all the questions I had prepared. So I guess that's a good place to stop. Why don't you tell me where people can learn from you?
I am going through a bit of a transition in my own life. This coming year will be my last year teaching full-time at Penn State, and then I'm wanting to move forward with other possibilities, and I'm starting to do workshops with high school teachers and students about the creative process and how art can enrich people educationally, and specifically, can you teach creativity? So I've recently done a couple workshops with high school teachers, and that's about it. And I hope to do more writing on this subject and see how things unfold.
Sounds awesome. Well, thanks for being on my show, Chris.
You bet. And, congratulations to you on this whole endeavor. My sense is it's relatively new what you're doing, and I think it's pretty cool that you're making connections and both a maker and both on objects and experiences, and that you're certainly going to broaden people's experiences or ways to experience life differently just by the questions and the interviews that you're doing. So,
well, thank you.
Yeah. Good luck with everything, Amy.
Thanks. If you like this episode, you can visit us on iTunes and give us a rating. You can also find us on Instagram and Facebook at TWYH Podcast. Hey guys, I have some awesome news this week. If you remember from listening to the trailer at the beginning of this season, the reason I've been doing all these interviews is to learn more about what it takes to start a school and teach. Along the way, my friend Chris Proctor and I have been taking what we've learned and letting it shape the brand new craft school we're building together. The school is called Good City Craft School. Our website is goodcitycraft.com. And as of July 16th, we've started offering craft workshops in central Utah. Right now, we've got some woodworking classes on chip carving, chainsaw milling, and making cabriole legs, and we've got plans for some more on finishing, special joinery, and making a Windsor stool. Again, you can find out about all those workshops, as well as check out our blog and the show notes for this podcast at goodcitycraft.com. On a similar note, because I'm going to be spending so much time getting those workshops put together and organized in the next month or two, I've decided to take a little break from the podcast. There will be one more episode coming out 2 weeks from now. That's a bit of a special one. That's a conversation between me and Chris about the school, our hopes for the future, and what we think is going to be important moving forward. After that, we'll be back in a couple months with some new and exciting interviews. See you around. Teach with Your Hands is produced by Amy Costello. The music is Admin by Poddington Bear. Hear more at soundofpicture.com.
Wow, Mommy.